welcome back to my playroom. Today we're going to be talking about food dyes and kids with ADHD. I've got my mouse here to scroll through my notes because I've got lots of them, so let's get started. I'm Dr. Taylor. I talk about healthy relationships with food for kids and the science of feeding kids. So food dyes do not cause ADHD, and I addressed that in a previous video. You can watch that here. If you don't feel on the same page with me on that, go watch that first before you watch the rest of this. When we talk about the effects of food dye on kids, we have to take into account the dose. And the problem with a lot of discussion around the way that food dyes might affect kids with ADHD, we're leaving out the discussion of a dose-response relationship, meaning as you increase the dose of the food dye, you also see more of whatever you're looking for, like a behavior problem. The effects of the amount of food dye in like one gummy vitamin, for example, or one popsicle is going to be way different from the effects of like 8 bags of Skittles. But some of these studies that look at dose, look at huge doses like in 8 bags of Skittles. So we can't just make like a blanket statement about food dyes. We have to get more specific about doses and more specifics about what exactly are these outcomes that we're talking about. The dose makes the poison. You may have heard this phrase before, and this applies to everything: food dyes, vitamin, even water. Excessive amounts of anything can make you sick and can cause health problems. So when you're consuming information about food dyes and the person presenting that information doesn't discuss the dose, that should be a major red flag. Like if they hold up a box of M&Ms in a Costco and say, these are bad because of the food dyes, but they don't talk about the amount of food dyes, red flag. Another red flag is when someone says food dyes cause aggressive behavior or hyperactivity. We have 0 studies that demonstrate a cause and effect relationship between food dyes and hyperactivity or aggression at normal amounts of food dyes that a child would consume in a human child, not in a rodent. We don't even have a confirmed mechanism for the proposed association for food dyes and behavior. We have theories, and I'll mention that later. So real quick, red flags before we move on when you're like reading blog posts or information online or consuming Instagram videos about food dyes and kids, particularly food dyes in kids with ADHD. Food dyes cause ADHD. That's wrong. Red flag if someone says that. Food dyes are bad without mentioning the dose. That should be a red flag. And food dyes cause certain behaviors. Also a red flag. If someone says that, then they don't understand how to interpret the literature or they don't understand what they're talking about. So let's kind of go back to the basics of food dyes. Like, how does the FDA, the US FDA, set the amounts of food dyes that are allowed in our food supply? So the ADI, or the acceptable daily intake, dietary intake, how much is acceptable to eat in a day? Those were established between 1969 and 1981 for food dyes, or 1986. The ADIs were established using mostly rodent studies, which did show that really large amounts had an effect on behavior. So to make these ADIs, the FDA, sorry for all these acronyms, looked at the amount of food dye at which you started to see no effect on the rodents, and they divided it by 100 and established the ADI. So how much is acceptable for a person to eat per day? So the point at which you start to see negative health outcomes from these food dyes is 100 times greater than what is allowed per day in the food supply. So now we have that foundation. Let's look at some of the data and the research together. So first, there's this 2012 meta-analysis, which showed that in a small number of kids with ADHD, high amounts of food dye consumption may worsen symptoms like hyperactive behavior. And the term symptoms is used in this paper. However, ADHD is a neurotype. It's just the way that their brains are, but we're going to use the language from this paper for consistency's sake. But the data in this study is not robust. And this data doesn't apply to all kids with ADHD, and the data comes from parent reports or teacher reports. It doesn't come from like an independent, objective observer of the child's behavior. While the improvement of removing dyes from a child's diet varied from study to study, it was about 1/3 to 1/6 the effect size of starting a kid on ADHD medication. So removing food dyes wasn't huge, but it did have a little effect for some kids. So within this meta-analysis, studies that looked at like concrete psychometric testing were really limited. Studies that looked at only food dyes used in the US versus other countries were also limited. So the data is here, but it's not conclusive and it's not super strong. Also, another issue with the data from this paper is they didn't discuss dose, and a lot of the research was on a combination of food dyes rather than like specific ones. So from that paper, the conclusion is food dyes may affect a small number of kids with ADHD, but the evidence is not really robust. Next, I looked at a review of 27 clinical trials that was a bit more recent, and there was also a lot missing from this paper. Even though it was like a good meta-analysis, there's still like a lot of information missing that we just don't have. Number one, I was surprised that there wasn't more human studies on the effect of red dye number 40 on behavior, because I feel like this is the dye that most people are worried about online. There was a lot more information on yellow number 5, so I thought that was interesting. Of the 27 studies in this paper, only 3 looked at a dose-response relationship, and all of them were about yellow number 5. And of these 3, only one of them found a relationship, a dose-response relationship between yellow number 5 and behavior. But in this paper, much of the doses that they used were really high. So for example, they looked at 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, and 50 milligrams of yellow number 5 per day. For context, 1 8-ounce yellow, like lemon lime Gatorade, has 3.8 milligrams of yellow number 5. And one of these groups was looking at 50 milligrams. So huge, like more than 80 ounces of Gatorade there. In addition, most of the animal toxicity studies have huge doses, which is how toxicity research is done, but we can't necessarily translate that to like the small amount that most human children eat on a daily basis of food dyes. So while there wasn't a lot of dose response studies on yellow number 5, there was one interesting study in Australia. It was done on either like 34 or 35 kids, and they did dose them amounts of yellow number 5 to see if they had a behavior response. This is human children. And so the researchers determined that some of these kids were responders, and of these responders, there was a significant behavior effect when they were given yellow number 5. However, it was a small study, and some other repeat studies have found the same thing, and some other repeat studies haven't found the same data. So I wouldn't take this and be like, it absolutely has an effect on kids or all kids at these doses. This is one small study, and it does not make conclusive information. Now, what about mechanism? Like, if food dye is affecting kids, what is the mechanism here? Well, 2 potential mechanisms are oxidative stress or something to do with histamine metabolism, but we don't really know for sure, and there's a lot of conflicting information in the literature. So do we have more updated research about the health effects of food dyes on kids than when the ADIs were originally established in like the 60s, 70s, and 80s? Yes, we absolutely do. Does this warrant a reevaluation of what these acceptable daily limits are? I think so, but we need to remember how these acceptable daily limits were calculated. They looked at the amount that caused no health effects and then divided it by 100. So there's still a huge buffer zone between what we realistically get in our food supply and those high amounts that we saw negative health outcomes in the rodent studies. Now, some will argue that we have data that shows negative health outcomes from the small amounts that's realistically consumed in like the standard American diet of a child. And that I don't think we can conclusively say. Most of the current research we have that looks at the health outcomes of food dyes in children is looking at huge doses. It's not even in children, it's in rodent studies. They're really small studies, or they're using subjective reporting methods like parent surveys or parent reports. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't use these studies in decision making, because studies like this, it's like the beginning of the scientific process. We have to do studies like this before we can do these like big crossover, randomized, double-blind interventions in human kids. But we just need to take these studies with a grain of salt. We shouldn't grab this study and say, food dyes are bad for all children and we need to completely eliminate them from our food supply. We don't have the data to say that. effect. So here's my conclusions. If you've been waiting for this, here it is. So from the totality of the research, it appears that food dyes may affect some kids, but they don't affect all kids at like reasonable doses that like a kid would typically consume. They may affect some kids with ADHD, and they may affect some kids who are responders with food dyes who don't have ADHD. Now, are these responders just kids who are ADHD that haven't been diagnosed? Do they have some sort of genetic predisposition to be affected by food dye? We also don't know that. And then for the kids who food dyes may affect, like the responders or the small percentage of kids with ADHD, do huge amounts of food dyes affect their behavior? Yes. Talking like 7.5 packs of Skittles, like the big packs, or 80 ounces of yellow Gatorade. But do small amounts affect behavior? That is much more like murky and uncertain. And then for the kid with like the highest percentile of food dye consumption, like the 95th percentile of food dye consumption, would that amount affect behavior? More likely, but for a child like this, their diet is also probably really high in sugar, low in fruits and vegetables, low in essential nutrients like fiber and maybe some vitamins and minerals. And there also may be other circumstances at play here, like medical conditions, poverty, food access. So in these situations, can we really say it's the food dye alone, or is it a combination of factors? Probably combination. So what should you do as a parent who is digesting all of this science that I'm giving you about food dyes in kids? Mostly it would be the same recommendations as before you learned about food dyes in kids. Offer your kids as much diet variety as you can. Offer fruits and vegetables and lean meats and whole grains and dairy. Enjoy food with your kids and prioritize a healthy relationship with food. When you're presented with a choice to choose a food containing food dye and an alternative food without the food dye, sometimes choose the one without. But I do also want to recognize that choosing the one without is a privilege because oftentimes those products are more expensive. So what I just said does not equal avoid food dyes all the time. And I don't think it means that you need to stress about food dyes or track food dyes in your kid's food. Now, if you feel that your kid is significantly affected by food dyes, they're one of the kids who respond and it's having a big negative effect on your kid's quality of life, and you want to do like a low dye or dye-free diet, tread lightly. Do what you can to offer similar/identical alternatives and minimize restriction as much as possible. While it is certainly possible to foster a healthy relationship with food for kids with dietary restrictions, for food allergies, for example, it is harder. What we want to avoid here is a kid who is fearful of food, who sneaks food because they're so heavily restricted and because they have no autonomy over their food choices, or a kid who becomes obsessed with the healthfulness of their food. And being extreme with food dyes can lead you down that road. Not to mention that it's probably not necessary for most kids anyways. And last, if you are choosing to observe your child's behavior after consuming food dyes, be careful observing them after they eat Halloween candy or after they eat cupcakes at a birthday party, because their behavior is probably already going to be different and maybe a little dysregulated after an overstimulating and exciting and fun event like that. And you as the parent are not above the placebo effect. Same with me. So for a typical kid, even a typical kid with ADHD who's not eating like packs and packs of Skittles or bottles and bottles of Gatorade every day, food dyes is probably not something that you really need to worry about. I know the conclusions I'm drawing here are way more nuanced and way less inflammatory of other people on the internet, but we're sticking to the data here. I hope you found this information helpful. Like and subscribe for more videos on feeding kids with ADHD and healthy relationships with food for kids. See you next time. Okay, bye.